I appreciate those last two hymns. They're going to tie in very well to our continued series here in Ecclesiastes. So if you turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're going to continue with what we've been able to get into the last few weeks, the last couple chapters here in Ecclesiastes. This is not a decidedly Father's Day message, although there will certainly be application, dads. That may be a relief to you, though. I don't know if there's a joke with pastors that when a Mother's Day comes around, mom's mom's the best thing ever. The message is, moms, thank you so much. We couldn't live without you, which is true, moms. There's nothing false in that. But then when Father's Day comes around, it's like, dads, what's wrong with you? Let's fix this. Let's fix our problem with our dads today, So we're not going to hopefully do that, at least as much anyway. So dads, you may be a little relieved that it won't be totally targeted straight at you. Appreciate your prayers for Pastor Whitmer. He will be returning early this week. I know he is excited to be back. We always, as a staff, we know when he's ready to get back because that's when we start getting texts from him while he's still on vacation and emails. So whenever we receive those, we know he's had a good vacation, he's ready to come back and get things going again. But please pray for him and safety as they make their travels back here early this week. There's a universal truth when it comes to success in life. And it's that success, at least for the most part, is usually born out of adversity. So to the academic, the student, many hours are spent poring over books. Many sleepless nights are spent to find success in school. I don't envy those days back when I was in school. And I remember those long sleepless nights, which is hard to pull off at Bob Jones because you're not supposed to be up all night. And so you have to, strategically have the light on or your phone light or something to try to study. But we know about those sleepless nights, the agony of trying to stay awake to study for that test to find success at school. To the athlete who endures the rigorous, painful training to find success on the court or on the field. To the runner who endures the shortness of breath and pain of muscle fatigue to find success on the track. To the man or woman trying to find success at a job, working long and hard hours and finding little sleep. All to find success. Success usually rises from adversity. And we understand that, especially here in America. In fact, we encourage that. We tell our kids when life is hard, that's the way it's supposed to be. If you want to succeed, it's going to be a little hard. You're going to go through adversity. Adversity is a good thing for you. We appreciate that. We know and we teach that through adversity, greatness in a person can be achieved. And while we readily admit and accept this fact in most areas in life, when it comes to things which are in the hands of God, out of our control, we kind of fail to appreciate that concept, don't we? The truth that Solomon is teaching us today in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 is one that it's not easy for us to swallow. We don't like this truth. The truth that experience of adversity is better than that of prosperity. Solomon is teaching the experience of adversity is better than that of prosperity. The title of the message this morning is The Truth About, quote unquote, Better. The truth about better. If you look down with me, we're going to read in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. If you'd stand with me, out of respect for the Word of God, we'll read verses 1 through 14 of Ecclesiastes chapter 7. It says, a good name is better than precious ointment, in the day of death and the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and the gift destroyeth the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Say not thou, what is the cause? That the former days were better than these. For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight, which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, But in the day of adversity, consider, God also hath set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. You may be seated. In this passage today, we're going to see that Solomon gives us two reasons why trial and adversity are better, that's right, better than success. Two reasons why trial and adversity are better than success. The first thing that we see is that trial turns our focus to eternity. Trial and adversity turns our focus to eternity. To better understand what Solomon is saying here, it's important for us to go back into chapter 6, verse 12, where we left off last week, where Solomon raises the question. Verse 12, he says, of chapter 6, he says, "For who knoweth what is good for man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun?" If you remember, we finished there last week, and in these two kind of rhetorical questions, the answer obviously is fairly clear, but he's going to go on now to answer these more in depth. So Solomon left us last week with the question, how can we really know what is best for our life? Or how can we know that what the future holds for us? He then goes now into chapter 7, and he gives many phrases, many proverbs to give answer to that. The question of what is better. In fact, Solomon uses that word better 8 times in the verses that we are looking at today in this passage, talking about how contrary to what we would naturally think, life is better when adversity is being experienced. Now, how can that be? How can that be? You might think, Pastor, you can so easily say that, but you have not lived in my shoes. You have not walked in my shoes. You have no idea the weight of trial I am under right now. I'm just living to get out of this so that life can at least be bearable, let alone enjoyable right now. And if that is you, I encourage you to please take heart in the fact that God does understand. And what we are reading through here is his answer to that trial. But it's not just on how to get through that trial. You know, whenever we're in a trial and adversity in life, what is our main goal? What is our main prayer? Lord, get me out of this trial. Lord, I love you. I want to learn something, but please get me out of this trial. And then when the time of trial has ended, what do we say? We get down on our knees and we say, thank you, God, for delivering me from my trial and my adversity. You are such a good God to deliver me from this trial and adversity. That's typical of us as believers, right? We tend to celebrate goodness, what appears to be goodness in our life, but when adversity is there, the last thing we think is, I don't give thanks for this, I don't give praise for this. I pray to get out of this, and then hopefully at the end of it, when it's all said and done, I can get through it and praise God for getting me through it. So this isn't just about getting through the adversity, getting through the trial in life. Solomon is saying that these trials are actually beneficial to us, more than even living with ease and comfort. He begins in verse 1, talking about the importance of reputation. And this is going to tie into what we're talking about in a moment here. It's going to make sense. But he starts it off with this talk about the importance of reputation. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. And that phrase, precious ointment, refers to a kind of a cologne or perfume that would make sense to us today. So the proverb here is, while the scent of perfume may be pleasant, it will eventually fade away. So we enjoy it for a time, it fades away, so that very, very consistent with his message so far about the things of the world. Like perfume, those things are pleasant for a moment, they will pass away. But a reputation is something that will stick. And that will stay with a man for years and years to come. So we could say, who we are is more important than what we have or do not have. Who we are is more important than what we have or what we do not have or what our circumstance is right now. The most important thing is who we are or our reputation in life. Now, as I was going through this, I couldn't help but think of one of my personal heroes. Those of you that know me know I'm a big Tim Tebow fan. Not necessarily because of his football career. That obviously hasn't taken off quite so well. Although I'm amongst friends here with the Eagles fans, right? We'll see how he makes out this year, if he stays with the team or not. But I like him, though, and I respect him for a different reason. And that is that he appreciates the idea of reputation, okay? Now, it's not necessarily a reputation of what he does. See, everybody can kind of understand and appreciate the idea of reputation. Yet we get caught up in making our reputation something that really isn't important at all, like maybe our job or the things that we have. Tim Tebow said this. He says, I don't judge my self-worth as a football player. Football is something I love. It's a fun career deal, but it's not what I want to do with my life because I see football as just a game. His motto in life, who he is, and everybody knows it, is that his reputation is not himself. It is not in what he does, what he has. It is in Christ. And so he lives his life to build his reputation for Christ. And I know his goal is that when he dies, he wants people to know of him and say of him, not that he was a football player, not that even that he was a nice guy, but that he was a man of God and he was a lover of Christ. That's the reputation that we're talking about here. We understand reputation is important, but we have to make sure that our reputation is in the right thing. So what about you? Dads, as husbands, as fathers, what is your reputation at work, in your neighborhood, at church, and most importantly, at home? Are you a man of integrity? Are you seeking to be exemplary in every area of your life? Does your name mean something? Not for you, but for God. You know, I've attended a lot of funerals since I've come here to Lighthouse, my first pastorate here, and so I haven't been used to going to so many funerals as I have been in the last couple years. But it always whenever I'm at one, it always makes me focus on the reputation of the person. That's kind of what is usually talked about, right? And it's fascinating to me to see the different reputations that people leave behind. And I've been to funerals where the reputation is good. And the reputation of that person was that they loved God and that they dedicated their life to serving God. And it's encouraging. It's a blessing to hear that. But we've all been to some as well where that isn't necessarily the case. And they may have a reputation, but it's not necessarily of God. It's of he was a successful businessman. And that's about it, you know. Or, you know, he was successful in this area. He loved to do this. He loved to do this. And that was the extent of the reputation. What kind of reputation are you leaving? It makes you think when you were at funerals, what will people say about me when it is my time? When I am in that casket and people are there, what will they say about me? What will my reputation in this world be? Solomon concludes verse 1 by saying, in the day of death than the day of one's birth. So the day of death is actually better than the day of your birth. That makes no sense to us either. We're thinking, okay, you know, when someone is born, that's a massive time of celebration. Everybody's excited. We have showers. We have get-togethers. Family gets together. When the baby is first presented to all the church, everybody's excited. You know, we're excited about births. So how can he say that it is actually better, the death, the celebration, not the celebration, but the recognition of death is better than that of birth? What's he saying? Don't misunderstand him. Solomon here is not speaking in despair about life, okay? We know even from our study last week that his desire and counsel is to enjoy your life. That's the purpose of this book, is to help us know how we can enjoy life. But in this passage, he does not live in denial of death either. He does not live in denial of death. He is pointing here again to the blessing of coming to the end of one's life, having lived that life, invested in building the right kind of reputation, than that of perhaps having a joyful and a fun beginning, but ending with a terrible or a poor reputation. Solomon continues in verse 2 by saying, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. So Solomon continues here. He tells us that it is better for a man to attend a funeral than for him to go to a party. And you're thinking, I don't like the sound of that either, because I don't like going to funerals. In fact, when I go to funerals, I can't really wait to get out and get my mind off of the funeral and how I feel at the funeral and have more pleasant feelings by getting out of it. So he's saying it's better to be at a funeral than to have fun at a party. What's he saying? He gives the reason. He says, every man is going to die. He says, every man, all of us, everyone in this room, everyone that has ever lived, everyone that is ever going to live is going to die. That's what he's saying. It's a reality. It's not meant to be depressing. It's meant to call attention to the reality of life. Solomon is saying that the wise man is a man who comes to terms with the fact that he is not going to live forever. And even though that is the truth, how often do we try to escape the reality of it? Don't we? We don't want to wake up and think, I'm going to die someday. Every morning, right? That's not our first thought. We try to escape the reality of death. We don't want to think about it. And we think that that's an okay way to live, to not live in the reality of death, to not be thinking about death. And in fact, you might be thinking, it's not healthy to be thinking about your death all the time. That's really morbid. And it can be if you're thinking of it in the wrong light. But Solomon here is saying that if you're thinking of it in the right light, then thinking on death, dwelling in the reality of death is in fact a good thing. Especially when I first came here, I didn't like going to the funerals or even participating in funerals because it was depressing. And it was for a lot of reasons, but I realized the main reason was that it was causing me to look death in the face head on. And it's uncomfortable. It's revealing about who we are. It causes us to have thoughts of ourselves that we don't usually have, and oftentimes those thoughts don't make us feel too good because we know how we are, right? And so we try to escape the reality of death. But the reality is, Solomon is teaching us here that living in the reality of death leads to a richer and a fuller life. Living in the reality of death leads us to a richer and a fuller life. There's a song, and the song, it talks about a man who has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and someone asked the man in the song, "Well, what are you going to do now? What's going to happen? You're about to die. What's going to happen?" And the man goes on to say how he's going to live his life to the fullest now. This is not a Christian song, as far as I know, and so it's interesting that the world, even to a point, understands this. But there's a phrase in the chorus that is kind of the repeated phrase, and it's this phrase: "Live like you were dying," and that is perfectly applicable to what Solomon is saying right here. Live like you were dying. Not in a depressing way, not in a morbid way where you curl up in the corner in your room and don't do anything at all, but live like you're dying. Know that your time is short on this earth and that every moment, every second has meaning. And that we do give an account for what we will do in our time while we are here on this earth. Are we living like we are dying? Funerals remind us that life is short and we need to think seriously about our lives. In verses 3 and 4, Solomon says, "Sorrow is better than laughter. For by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth." So again, he continues this. The wise is the one that is in the house of mourning. Solomon here speaks to the benefit of sorrow and mourning. And again, you might be thinking, this is really morbid. This doesn't make any sense. Am I really supposed to just dwell in death all the time and just think about that and mourn all the time? No. Again, he is using these as illustrations to help us keep a reality of life at the forefront of our mind and our thoughts. Let me ask you a question. Though we would all prefer to live in a constant state of happiness and laughter, and we would certainly want to pick the party over the funeral, when was the last time you were driven to God, driven to thoughts of eternity, driven to the realities of life and death, driven to wisdom while experiencing a life of ease, pleasure, contentment, and laughter? The last time I was driven to my knees before God, seeking wisdom, seeking guidance, facing the realities of life, was not at the last party I attended. It just wasn't. Now, is that to say that there's no place for enjoyment in life and parties, birthday parties and whatever parties, graduation parties, all those types of things? Not at all. But when you live a life that is solely set on the pleasures of those things, do you ever really get to a point where you're driven to the reality of what is important in life? No. The answer is no, we're not. The way we are, we oftentimes have to be in a place where we are in moment of sadness, of adversity, the greatest of adversities that's being talked here about mourning, about death. Living in light of that does not have to mean that we are morbid and depressed, but when we see that, we think, that's right, I have to get back up. I have to start living like I'm dying, making the most of my life, making sure that the choices I make count for something in eternity. Again, going back to verse 1, building your reputation. That's what we're talking about. Solomon is not condemning happiness. It's just the opposite. He is advocating an appropriate peace and contentment that is not based on temporal circumstances alone. Do you have the proper perspective on life? Because when you have the proper perspective on life, that sets you up very well to start having the reputation and building the reputation that will last far beyond your years. What kind of reputation are you building right now? What kind of perspective do you have? My grandfather, I've used examples of him before, he passed away a few years ago, and he served in World War II, so I loved hearing stories about his time in World War II. He was in the Navy. And he had a hard time sharing anything about that. And those of you that maybe have served or have family members that have served, typically is the case. It's hard to talk about, at least for some time. But he began to open up in his later years, and he told me a story one time about he was in the Navy on one of the cargo type ships, LSTs that would carry the cargo and heavy equipment such as tanks and jeeps right to the beach. And so it's pretty cool. It's a ship that would go, massive ship, go right up onto the beach, and the bow would actually open up like a gate, and all the tanks and jeeps would just drive right off onto the beach. And he told me a story one time. They were on a beach in Italy somewhere. And so there was the beach, and then right after the beach, there was either two mountains or two hills that came down and kind of formed a V. And he talked about there was a lot of rumor about German planes being in the area, so be on the lookout. And he said that he remembered looking up, and he saw a German plane coming right between the V of those two hills. And long story short, they got bombed. Their ship was bombed, and everything was in chaos. Everything was kind of all over the place. Men were jumping ship. He almost jumped ship, but decided not to, which ended up actually saving his life. But it was either that point or after that point that he said, I remember at that point I got down and I called out to God. I said, God, if you spare me from this war, I will live a life for you. He was in his 20s at that point. And that story could probably be said in some same manner for several thousands and thousands of men that fought in that war and many wars to come and before then. In fact, it was said that after World War II, colleges and Bible colleges and universities flooded with men wanting to go into ministry. Why? Why do you think that is? 20-somethings. What did 20-somethings usually do with their life? They partied up usually, right? I mean, that's the time, that's the prime of life. That's when you live to enjoy life. Yet those men were doing the exact opposite. They were over fighting on a battlefield, watching death every single day, and wondering if they themselves might die every single day. It's part of why that we call them the greatest generation. They came back, and because of what they had witnessed, they gained a proper and a new perspective on what really mattered in life. Death does await us all. But we perhaps, like so many people, choose not to think about it, but rather can only see what sits right in front of us. We're so close-minded. We're so narrow-minded. We think about our next project. Some of you might have tomorrow laid out, know what you're doing tomorrow. Some of you might have the week laid out. Some of you that are real prepared might have your month laid out. You might even have a year, a lot of your vacations and your events planned out. But even that is so narrow-minded compared to the breadth of what really matters in life. And Satan wants nothing more than for us to be distracted by what's right in front of us, to where we fail to recognize the big picture that we are going to die someday. But when we recognize that causes us to be motivated to say, I want to live more now. It adjusts our choices day by day when we remember that we have a point when we will leave this earth. Failing to think about death usually means that we are failing to think about life. Failing to think about death usually means that we are failing to think about life. Where is your perspective? What kind of reputation are you building? Trial and adversity give us an eternal perspective, but we also see in verses 5 through 14 that number 2, trials produce Christ-like character. Trials produce Christ-like character. Verse 5 and 6 says, "It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity." Famous catchword there in Ecclesiastes. This also is vanity. So here we have another illustration from Solomon. And this one is a little more culturally relevant to his time. He talks about the voice of fools, the song of fools being like the crackling of thorns under a pot. What he's talking about there, in that time when you were building a fire, it was common if you wanted a quick fire that would ignite very quickly and give a lot of heat, give a lot of sparks off, you would get a thorn bush or branches from a thorn bush and you cast on the fire. And it would give you a very immediate, very hot, very bright fire for a few moments, and then it would go out. The best example I can think of over here in America would be, I was kind of a pyro, so this seems like common sense to me growing up anyway. But for those that may not know, over here, the best example of that are pine branches. If you have a fire and you want real quick heat and you want the kind of fun of the pop and crackle of something, you just grab a big old branch of off a pine tree somewhere and throw it on, and that's the idea. Okay, it ignites very quickly. It gives you a big fire, gives you a lot of heat, a lot of sparks, a lot of crackle. It's fun to watch, but it's out in a few moments. I mean seconds. It's pretty much gone, and it's back down to where it was before. That's the example that he's saying here. Okay. He uses this illustration to say that the praise of fools is quick, it's hot, it's showy, but it is gone quickly. It flames up, it dies out, and you need something else then to stoke the fire with. Then on the other side, in comparison to the quick fire that goes out, the praise of fools, the words, the voice, the song of fools, he says that the rebuke of a wise man, if you follow the illustration, ultimately it's going to be lasting. It's going to last forever. Again, something else we don't like hearing too much, right? So you're saying, Pastor Josh, that we've got to enjoy getting rebuked now. Yep, that's pretty much what I'm saying. There is much blessing and much that we can learn when we are men and women that know how to receive rebuke. It's not said just to be a good thing. It's said here to be a wise thing. A mark of a wise man, a mark of a wise woman is one that is willing to graciously receive rebuke. That is hard. No one in this room likes to receive rebuke. And I'm at the top of the list. It may be that we have sin in our life that someone has come along and rebuked us over. It may be our boss at work who just, isn't satisfied with what we've done and has to rebuke us for something. It may be a spiritual leader in your life that has to confront you in a matter. It may be even your spouse who knows you best that has to confront you on a matter. Dads, it might even be your kids sometimes. I always hear, I obviously don't know this yet, but I've heard stories, the dad that doesn't know the kids in the room or in the car or whatever, and just goes off on something, all of a sudden a little voice from the back, quotes a verse that just totally shuts him down, and it's just silent in the car. It's like, ooh. Told Daddy. I'm sure I'll experience that someday. But sometimes we even receive rebuke where we don't expect it, right? Are you a man and a woman that can receive rebuke? Teens and kids, are you teachable with your mom and dad? The ones that love you the most and want the best for you. Wisdom says, I will listen to the rebuke that I am receiving right now with grace, with love, with patience. A fool says, no, don't listen to that rebuke. Are we walking in wisdom or are we walking as fools? Can you receive a rebuke from a person? There are some in this room, perhaps, who, if you're honest with yourself, would have to admit that the only person you are ever really willing to listen to is either yourself or someone who thinks the same way you do? Right? We can readily talk all day long with someone else that agrees with us, but the moment that someone has to rebuke us for something that is contrary to what we think we should do or something, then immediately our defense is put up. It's the response of a fool. A wise man is gracious and is humble and receives rebuke. The main adversary to this is obviously our pride, right? We hate to be wrong. We like to think that we know best and that we have all the answers to everything and that without a doubt I am right. Who are you to say I am wrong? You know who I am? That is exactly what a fool says. It feels right. It makes us feel good. Flashy, whatever. But it's not wisdom. Wisdom is willing to accept rebuke with humility and learn from it. Some of my greatest moments of adversity in my own life have been times of rebuke. When even if I didn't know it at the time, I realized later I needed it. In times of an adverse moment of rebuke, are you willing? Are you humble enough to receive it? Solomon goes on in verses 7 through 10. He says, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and the gift destroyeth the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days are better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. Oppression and hardship seemed to rule back in the days of Solomon, perhaps, and they seem to be no different in our society today, right? Solomon here is speaking of the temptation for a wise man to observe the oppression that is surrounding him. And this could be oppression that is personal, whether it's a specific circumstance that you are going through right now, or it could be the oppression of the world in general. The temptation for a wise man is to observe that oppression, and it says to go mad. That word mad, it talks about or the idea of going impatient with life, impatient with people, impatient with the circumstances around us. And on the other side of the coin, the temptation to allow the temporal gifts of life to reign in our life. Two extremes that we ought not follow as wise men, but they are certainly temptations to every wise man. In verses 8 through 10, Solomon describes the wise virtue of living life with what? With patience. Living life with patience. In verse 10, it talks about the fool that constantly looks to the past as better than the present. As if God has lost control or is better in control in the past than he is right now. When I read that, I couldn't help but think of John and Linda, actually. We like to, when we worked together here in the office, we'd have good discussions politically a lot of times. And one time he told me, he's like, I can't stand it when people talk about how awesome life was back when Ronald Reagan was president. And he's like, I just get tired of it. He's like, he's dead. He's gone. He's not coming back. And if you know John, it's just funny. But I would laugh. And the fact is, he's totally right. And I love Ronald Reagan. I wasn't even born when he was around. I love him. So I appreciate who he is. And I'm not saying if you like Ronald Reagan, this is a problem or anything. But how often do we like to creep into that idea of life was so much better back when you fill in the blank? And that could be for the whole scale of America. That could be for your personal life. Life was better when I lived back here. When I lived in Hawaii, life was better. That might be true. But not really. We like to look back on times that we feel are better. We always tend to look and remember things and the good things in life, don't we? And maybe it's a good thing, but we fail to often remember the hardships that existed back then as well. Solomon here is teaching that we ought not glory in the past and look to the past as if God is not working right now. I was talking with somebody about the upcoming election here, presidency, and we were talking about candidates and everything, and we kind of had our ideas. And then in the end, and they just kind of said, God will have who he wants to be president. I was kind of like, yeah, you're right. That doesn't excuse us from desiring and pushing and voting and doing everything we can to get the one that we believe would be the best president in there. But in the end, they were right. God will decide. And do you think that God, because time seemed better to us back in the day, that God was much more in control back then and the world's in chaos now? God, what's happening? No, God is just as in control today as he was in the past. Don't glory in the past. Live in the now with the glory and the hope of what we know is coming. The end of the story has yet to come. And we as Christians ought to know that better than any. The end of the story has yet to come. A wise man lives where he is at with the hope of the future with much, what does he say? Patience. With patience. Chuck Swindoll once said, true patience is waiting without worrying. Waiting without worrying. It's not, so we're not just waiting. We're not worrying. There's an aspect of that where you're saying, God, you are sovereign. You are in control. I not only know that, I believe that. And when you reach that point, life is so much better. So much better. We have nothing to worry about. Patience is waiting without worrying. Are you worrying? Maybe about where you are at personally, or where your family is at right now, things that are going on, and you're remembering better times and wondering, where is God? Are you worried about your country? And you ought to be. But do you worry and understand that God, though we may not understand what is going on, we know that what seems better to us now is not necessarily better? Are we trusting God? Sometimes better doesn't always look better. It is only through adversity that character is tested and grown. So hard as it may be, rejoice and grow in it with great patience, knowing that the end will certainly be better than the beginning. And we know that, don't we? Christ will reign supreme one day. We have nothing to fear. We have nothing to worry. Don't get caught looking down at the next day and the next day and freaking out about what's all going around. Know the big picture. And have patience. Wisdom has patience. Verses 11 and 12 say, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Again, we see Solomon not condemning prosperity in life. He's saying that it is a good thing if the prosperous person behaves in a wise way. Talks about how both money and wisdom are a defense, or they are a protection to us, and that is true. They can be. But the superiority of wisdom is that it guides one through difficult times and preserves life, while money is fickle, and money alone will often not bring the true comfort that we hope it might. It's temporal. Solomon concludes this section in verses 13 and 14. He says, consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which hath been made crooked? I like that phrase. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. And so here at the end, we see the immutability and inscrutability of the ways of God. Who can straighten what God has made crooked? You ever try to straighten a hanger, a metal hanger? You can get close maybe, but you never quite get it, right? That's the idea. When God has made something crooked, who are we to try to straighten it? We can't. And so for those who are on the day of prosperity, don't be distracted. Don't feel guilty. Rejoice and be glad in your prosperity. But in the day of adversity, and that day will come, and there will probably be many days of adversity in your life. When those days come, remember, consider, in bad times, that adversity has inscrutable purposes that are far beyond our finite, puny human understanding. And again, to get this at all, you have to first understand the reality of who we are as humans, our finite nature, and then the reality of God, infinite nature. Again, it takes an extra dose of humility to get to that point, but to understand this and grow from this and benefit from this, you have to start there. Someone said it this way: God does not waste sorrow or adversity. God does not waste sorrow or adversity. He knows the purpose for which we go through tragedy and sorrow. It is for our good, and it's for the good of His kingdom. And we can certainly trust that those trials and adversities will give us an eternal perspective that we need at that time, though it may not be what we want. And that perspective is to actually live like we were dying and to see our lives molded into the men, the women, the teens, the children that God desires us to be. Better to God isn't always what better looks like to us. But remember, God does not waste sorrow and adversity. Are you someone who is willing to accept not only good from God, but also adversity? It's easy to sit and pray and say, God, thank you for the goodness of your life. Thank you for my new car. Thank you for my new house. Thank you for my family. Thank you for my job. Thank you for all the money that you've given me. But as soon as any one of those things is taken away, do you actually sit down and say, God, thank you for giving me perspective right now? Perspective that I need desperately. It's a mark of wisdom. The story is told of an elderly Christian man. He was a good singer. But he unfortunately, to him at least, at the time, learned that he had cancer. And that surgery was required. And in the hospital, after everything was ready for the operation, the man said to the doctor, "Are you sure I will never sing again? You have cancer of the tongue." And the surgeon found it difficult to answer his question, but he simply looked at him and shook his head. "No, you won't. You'll never sing again." The patient then asked if he could sit up for a moment. He said, "I've had many good times singing the praises of God." He said, "And now you tell me I can never, ever sing again." He said, "I have one song that will be my last. It will be of my gratitude and praise to God." So there in the doctor's presence, the man sang softly the words of Isaac Watts' hymn, "I'll praise my Maker while I've breath. And when my voice is lost in death, praise shall employ my nobler power. My days of praise shall ne'er be past, while life and thought and being last, or immortality endures." Perspective. This man had it. So the truth about better is that it doesn't always look better. But living in true wisdom means we allow those trials to turn our focus to things eternal, and with great patience and with great humility, allow those trials to mold us to be more and more and more and more like God. That in the end, we can have the right kind of reputation and the legacy that is befitting, that is right for us as believers. Would you bow your head?